Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one, I'm going to be stepping away from woodworking and picking up another small hobby. So as a lot of you guys have pointed out, because I'm doing woodworking full time, I'm spending every day in the shop, I need something to do that is still, creative and fun like that, but isn't totally woodworking related. And that is exactly what we're going to be doing today. So for the longest time now, I've wanted to get into making knives, making tools, that kind of thing. And so one of my biggest influences here on YouTube has been Alex Steele. Now this dude's the same age as me, but he has this amazing career as a blacksmith all the way from when he was in super young. So he's one of those people that I find super impressive. Now, he does blacksmithing. What I'm doing here is going to be knife making, two completely different things, but someday I do hope to get into blacksmithing when I have a bigger shop and more space. But for now, all I can do is do some simple knife making. So it's taken me a while to figure out how I wanted to start doing this because I wasn't able to find any good kind of tutorials online about how you go from not making knives to making knives. So one day I was on YouTube and I stumbled across this video by Redbeard Ops talking about exactly how you go from a piece of steel to a functional knife, and he covered all the details. And he answered the two biggest questions that I had that were preventing me from getting into making knives. First off, what kind of steel you need, because there's tons of different kinds of steel out there apparently that I didn't know about, and how to heat treat that specific kind of steel. Because again, as I've kind of learned in my research, every single kind of steel is going to be heat treated differently. The other awesome part about his tutorial is it gives you a free set of plans to actually base your first knife off of, so now I know that I'm making exactly this knife. I don't have to try and design the knife and everything. All I need to do is just base my knife off of what the drawing on this piece of paper, which is just super awesome. So in that video, he does a really good job of explaining how to do things with kind of the beginner method with just using files. But I know I'm kind of impatient, and this is something I actually want to really get into. So I started by getting a 1x30 belt grinder. Now this is from Amazon. It's the Wen brand. I don't expect anything spectacular from this belt grinder, but it was better than spending $2 grand on an actual knife making belt grinder. Also from Amazon, I bought a little knife beveled grinding jig. Now apparently you can make these for super cheap if you already have all the materials sitting around. For me, when I priced it out, it was going to come out to about 150 bucks to get all the materials that I needed for it, but I was able to buy this off of Amazon for 50 bucks, so this just made more sense. I've also got a couple of fire bricks here that we're going to be using to make our kiln later on for our heat treating. I've got a MAP gas torch on the end here. Then I've got some good epoxy for our handles, and then I've got some 1084 steel that I ordered from Knife Maker Supply here in Canada. So 1084 steel is supposed to be the most forgiving steel to use in the home heat treating process like we're going to be doing here. Because yeah, I don't have any fancy heat treating equipment. I don't really want to be paying to be sending this stuff out for fancy heat treating. So this stuff is gonna work for my purposes. I did buy a decent amount of it because like I said, I wanna get into this. One quick safety note before we jump into this, obviously using stuff like grinders, kilns, furnaces, whatever you wanna call them, all that kind of stuff, working with hot steel, does not blend very well with woodworking shavings and wood dust and all that kind of stuff around the shop. So what I've done is I made sure all this area around my workbench here, all of the surrounding area where sparks could land, I made sure to vacuum it out very thoroughly. As well as yesterday, I took the time to take an air blower and just blast out all the dust from the area. So the whole area around my workbench here where I'm going to be making sparks and that is completely clear of dust. I'm also going to be working on the back side of my workbench, so I'm well away from any of my machinery and that's set up. So we've got our knife roughed out here. It's pretty close to the plans. I still got some little bit of refining to do around the handle, but I think I'm supposed to do some of that later on. So right now we've got our shape mostly roughed out. Now we need to go through and drill our holes that we're gonna use for our pins later on and start doing some of our layout for, grinding in the bevel and all that kind of stuff. This stage of it was definitely a lot less intimidating than I thought it was gonna be. The grinder made things super easy. You guys saw how much material I left on there because I couldn't figure out how to cut it off with the hacksaw. So even with the fairly large amount of material I still had on here, especially around like the handle area here, I was able to grind it out using the 1x30 belt grinder here, and we are now left with a nice little knife. super glad I put the money into this grinder as well as that jig, because that made things really crisp and clean. We've got a nice even bevel running along both sides. We're almost at a nice sharp edge, but according to the video, you're supposed to leave about 3/1000ths of an inch on there. I also added the sharpening choil on the bottom here, which is actually a really interesting thing. I never really understood why knives had that little notch in there. Purely just so that you're not trying to jam these corners up against your sharpening stone. You can keep that edge about 3/16ths of an inch away from the sharpening stone, so it just makes sharpening a little bit easier. So what I would do differently next time is I would go much shallower with that initial grinding in of this shoulder here. So I used a chainsaw file to just kind of start the shoulder. And now that I have my full bevel ground, I still have some of those marks from the chainsaw file, so I think I just went a little bit too deep. I might be able to sand them out, I might not. Again, this is my first knife, so I'm not too concerned if it's not absolutely perfect. I'll probably be making a couple more of these. But overall, again, using this jig just made life so much easier. So now we're moving on to the heat treating part of this, so I gotta make my little kiln out of those 2 fire bricks and my MAP gas torch. So I'm gonna clear off the workbench here, get everything all nicely cleaned up again, so I have a nice, safe work environment. Because anytime you're dealing with a propane torch, or especially a MAP gas torch like I'm dealing with here, that's hotter than propane, you want to make sure you set everything up. Everything is as safe as possible in its position. So I'm going to get the workbench cleaned up, then we'll start making a little kiln out of those 2 fire bricks. So we are all set up and ready for probably the most terrifying part of this whole thing. So what we need to do is, using our little kiln here we just built, we're going to light up this MAP gas torch, let the kiln heat up a little bit. Then we will be holding our knife in the kiln for a little while with the pliers until our little magnetic stick here does not stick to it anymore. Once it's demagnetized, then we'll wait a little bit longer. From there, we'll go and quench it into some canola oil. So I've got the kiln all set up here. We've got everything nice and stable. We've got a brick in the back here to help the area warm up a little bit. I've got another one to put in the front once I get everything lit up and I know it's all working just fine. I'll put the other brick just in the front. I'm going to open the garage door up here. I'm going to set my tin of canola oil outside. That way when I go to dip it, if it overflows and decides to catch on fire, at least it's outside. I also chose this container very specifically at a pretty good expense to myself. This is my nice airtight sealing container that I normally keep my coffee in, but I figure that if the oil does light off when I dip the hot knife in there, because this seems totally counterintuitive, I can then close the lid and at least smother those flames that way. Through this whole thing, I'm going to be wearing some flame-resistant gloves. Again, I am terrified of fire at this point in time. This whole process just freaks me out big time, but it's one of those ones where, I know that this is something that is very normally done. But then once we have the quench done, then we're going to bring it over to the vise, which I have these 2 pieces of angle iron in, and I move my vise over to the workbench so it's not anywhere near the dust collection system, because again, the knife is going to be hot when we mount it in here. We're then going to clamp it in here between these 2 pieces of angle iron, which should help it cool down nice and straight. Anyway, I'm rambling on now because I'm getting extremely nervous to do this, but we're just going to go for it. So yeah, wish me luck. That was anticlimactic. So that was anticlimactic in the best way possible. I think it went good. We got all the knife to the whole point where the entire blade was non-magnetic, checking with my little magnetic stick here. So it wasn't magnetic along the whole length of the blade. Then I went, dipped it in the oil, and everything went fine. We didn't get any big fireballs. We didn't get really even any smoke either, which I find very interesting. The knife is now in the vise, and it's going to sit there for probably 1 to 2 hours, just kind of cool down slowly. The one thing that I find super interesting about this whole process is just how the heat works. So I stopped recording about 10-15 minutes ago, and these bricks are still very, very hot. There's still a lot of heat coming off of them, which is super interesting. I thought that as soon as I separated them, they would kind of lose all that heat, but obviously these bricks do a great job of holding in that heat and now they're just kind of emitting it back. So the oil can, after I dipped the knife, I wasn't expecting it to be as hot as it was. I didn't fully understand the fact that when you dip that hot knife into the oil, it is quite literally pulling all of that heat out and, you know, basically making it room temperature or whatever temperature the oil is. Now, I think the knife is still pretty dang hot when you pull it out of the oil, but dipping it in the oil pulls that heat out, and that's the whole point of quenching. And there's this whole interesting science in quenching. I've been looking into this lately as I was trying to figure out how to do this whole process. Apparently, there's some projects where you quench it in water because water will take the heat out even faster than oil, but the reason you use oil most of the time is because it'll take the heat out of the knife, but not nearly as quickly as water. So that I find super interesting. So there's no guarantee that my heat treating that I just did right here works. I'm gonna have to wait 1 or 2 hours for it to cool down before I can actually test it. Moment of truth time, we've got our blade that's nice and cooled down. We've got a file. What we're gonna do is slide the file over the edge of the blade here, and if the file skates over the edge of the blade, so you get a nice, I've heard this sound plenty in videos, so I don't know quite know how to describe it. So if the file skates across the edge there, then we know that our heat treat worked, and we're good to move on to the tempering stage. If the file bites in and is removing material, then we know that we're not ready to move on to the heat treat yet. I think that means we're good. Okay, so I had to grab one of the off-cut pieces from our initial piece. So this is what it sounds like when it's not heat treated. And this is what our blade sounds like. It's a very subtle difference, but I do think that that means our blade is good to go because we're not really moving material. We are removing some of the built up, I don't even know what to call it, smut or grime, whatever, that comes during the heat treat because we got all this black, like, it's almost like soot on the blade. We are removing a little bit of that, but we're not removing material from the edge. So I think we're good to go. So anyways, guys, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. A little outside of the woodworking content that you're probably used to, but definitely a cool little break from it. So as always, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.